the connection between fascism and alienation, and why alienation might be a good concept to understand fascism, is their own slogan, "Get back control." That means that this is a control issue. It's an issue not only about material losses and gains, even if they play an important role, but they are connected to the impression that one has lost control.
The concept of alienation has a long tradition. Karl Marx famously introduced the concept during the rise of industrial capitalism to criticize the working conditions of industrial workers. Yet, some might argue that alienation belongs to the 19th century and has little relevance for understanding contemporary society. Today's guest, Rahel Jaeggi, disagrees and believes that the idea of alienation is more relevant than ever before. In her book of the same name, she revitalizes the concept and calls it a relation of relationlessness, in which social subjects are not capable of appropriating the social relations within which they live. That's not it, though. Jaeggi believes that to understand the new rise of fascist and authoritarian parties and leaders in Europe and the United States, understanding alienation is crucial. Why? Let's turn to our guest, Rahel Jaeggi, to find out.
I'm Rahel Jaeggi. I'm a philosophy professor at Humboldt University in Berlin. I'm also the director of the Center for Social Critique at Humboldt University Berlin. I'm doing critical theory, teaching critical theory, interested in not only the tradition of critical theory, but mainly in bringing the topics, the concepts, the problems of critical theory and critical theories in the plural, of working with them in order to understand our societies or how to criticize society. So the contemporary situation is obviously a situation in which fascism and authoritarianism is on the rise, and there are a lot of efforts to understand what is actually going on here, what motivates those tendencies. I do think that alienation is a productive concept here, to be included amongst like the cluster of concepts that you need in order to understand what's going on. So I would actually say and defend that the rise of authoritarianism, the emergencies of, or the rise of fascism, of fascistization, that this can be understood and should be understood in terms of alienation. I do think that it's not just an economic problem in the narrow sense that drives people towards authoritarianism. It's also not just an anti-liberal, anti-democratic attitude of some sorts. I do think that the experience of alienation, the experience of not being in command of your own life, the sense of loss with respect to how to even play an influential part in your own life, is something that plays an important role in the affinity to authoritarianisms and fascisms. So I do think that this is a broader concept, or that because alienation does not only refer to problems of injustice, not only refer to affordability problems as such, but affordability problems may be in the context of what this means for autonomy and for the way we as societies and we as individuals can determine it, or are like capable of some kind of individual and collective self-determination. So I do think that alienation from democracy, democratic alienation, plays an important part here. And again, that the concept of alienation may be of help here. What is alienation? If you ask what would be the counter concept, the counterpart of alienation, there's a variety of options. You could say alienation is a loss of freedom, alienation is loss of control, loss of power. You can say that alienation is something like the loss of meaning, You are confronted with a world that is meaningless to you and in which you cannot play a meaningful part. And I do think that the interesting aspect of alienation is that it somehow brings together these different moments. So it is a heteronomy, but not in the simple sense of being dominated by someone else, because we are then dominated by something like a mute force, as Marx would say. We are dominated by something that is at the same time as the classical concept of alienation has it. We are alienated from our own actions. So it is at the same time ourselves and not ourselves who is the agent of alienation here. This is what makes the concept interesting, I think. So it has a lot to do with autonomy. If alienation is a modern concept and alienation is a concept in which a certain modern experience is described, then I would say that the loss of autonomy plays an important role here. But it's not only autonomy, it's more than that. Or put differently, it shows us that autonomy is much more demanding than just not being under the control of someone else. So it shows us the preconditions for autonomy, the social preconditions for autonomy, the way in which we need to relate to the world in order to be and become autonomous, instead of seeing autonomy as something that you can also do while just blocking out reality, social reality, or the others, or the other that you are related to.
The concept of alienation is famously associated with social philosopher Karl Marx. Marx mainly applied the concept as a critical tool to criticize the conditions industrial workers were dealing with in the 19th century. Jaeggi believes that some of Marx's thought still hold relevance to understand our contemporary situation.
So famously and interestingly, when Marx talks about alienation and alienated labor, he makes this distinction. Alienation means being alienated from yourself, being alienated from what you're doing, from your work, being alienated from your work, so from what you're doing, being alienated from the product of your work, being alienated from other human beings, and being alienated from what he calls species being. And this is I think this is interesting. I mean, the idea that it's my work that I'm alienated from, but also the product of my work. So while the way I act, I mean, in order to understand it more broadly, so my own action, the way I act, is something that is alienated from me, but also the result, the product that I'm, or even the goals that I achieve, are something that is alienated from me. And there is, of course, the very easy understanding to be alienated from the product means that you did not do it from scratch. If you create a table on your own, I mean, go in the woods, take the tree, create the table, and so on and so on. So the idea that only this relation would be a non-alienated relation to the product of my work, I think is not so illuminating here, but it has something to do with being in control of what is produced, what happens with the product, with a certain kind of transparency, even if you produce under the conditions of a division of labor, to be in a meaningful relation to the others that are part of this process, is something that reduces alienation and so on. So it is interesting to, I mean, to refer to those Marxian distinctions. Once again, it's the third dimension of alienation here, to be alienated from your fellow workers, which again can be broadened, being alienated from also from your fellow citizens, or from your fellow I mean, people that you are or should be in a certain kind of solidaristic relation with, and you are not. So this is what Marx, I mean, how Marx understands alienation, but it might be important to see that this is not what is so specific about Marx. I And the critique of alienation has been around, for a long time. And also around when Marx started to think about alienation. The interesting thing for Marx and with respect to Marx and what we can get from Marx is that he understood or tried to understand how alienation is a result of a certain social structure.
But one could at this point ask, why do we even need the concept? Couldn't we just say we live in an unjust society and that capitalism creates inequality and that we therefore have to change the social relations? According to Jaeggi, this is not enough. She argues that if we want to criticize and ultimately change problematic social relations, we need to understand what makes them problematic in the first place.
What is it that a critique of alienation captures that other modes of social critique cannot capture? If we once again go back to to the example of alienated labor, I think it's easy to see that, for example, you can criticize labor conditions in terms of exploitation or in terms of uh, justice, in terms of the unjust compensation for what you're doing there. But that does not cover the process of work itself. That does not cover the qualitative dimension of work. If it's just about my salary, which is important enough. I'm not saying that this is not an important part. But if it would just be about my salary, then any kind of work could do if it is, well paid. Alienation thematizes the quality of the work, and alienation thematizes the way in which those who work, those who are engaged in something, are in control of what they are doing. And this is a different dimension. I do think that they hang together, but it's a different dimension, and you could not, you can easily conceive of a, let's say, a just working arrangement that is still alienated. The question of whether you could imagine a non-alienated workplace that is not also, that does not also, that is not at the same time like a just arrangement, that is a difficult question to answer. I would say no. I do think that a certain idea of justice and freedom and meaningful work hang together here. But that's maybe enough in order to see what is at stake here, and that this is more than like a fair society. So just think about, let's say, the flight attendant who has to be polite all the time, who has to perform a certain role. It would not be enough to. So the question of whether she's well paid or not is not the only question that is at stake here. That it has also something to do with the kind of subject that she is turned into while performing this role. So once again, I think if we ask ourselves why and how is the flight attendant alienated or can be alienated, it's again a bit more difficult than we would think on first sight. You could say this is alienation because she has to perform a certain role. I would say we are always performing roles. It does not make any sense to ask for the essence of a person behind those roles. But it's a question of how one is able to appropriate those roles and the variety of roles that we are performing. Alienation is a relation of relationlessness, and this means that we have relations to ourselves, to other human beings, to the social world, to the material world. And the question of alienation is how those relations, the quality is a question about the quality of those relations. Relation of relationlessness also means that not being alienated does not mean that we should go back to some kind of a former unity with ourselves or with the world or something. It is a relation, and the relation can be distorted. Alienation is like so many ways of those relations being distorted. And there can be varieties of ways in which it is distorted.
Jaeggi calls alienation a relation of relationlessness. But that already involves the idea of some kind of relation. But what kind of relation is Jaeggi talking about here?
The concept of a relation of relationlessness also wants to point out that in order to talk about alienation in a meaningful sense here, there has to be a relation of some kind. So it does not make sense, and this is an example that my colleague Dan Brudney brings up in his Marx book. It would not make sense to talk about the aliens on Mars, the Martians, as people we are alienated from, because we do not have there's no relation at all. It's just strangeness. They are, as I said, aliens. To talk about alienation makes sense when it comes to a relation that is in some way established, but from another perspective distorted or absent in a certain way. So it does make sense to talk about, let's say, being alienated from your family or being alienated from solidaristic communities and solidaristic bonds. And what you assume then is that there has been a relation, there is some kind of a relation, or there should be some kind of some relation that then you are alienated from, meaning this relation, the relation itself is distorted. And this is an interesting and important point, I think. I mean, the claim that the relation is somehow pre-existent, and from the pre-existent relation there is some kind of aberration, which does not mean that, as I said, the pre-existent unity that you should be able to get back to, but, and this is why appropriation is so important for me here, a relation that you are able to actively appropriate instead of just passively endure. Another way to talk about alienation is to say what we experience here is that we do not have ourselves at our command. The world and ourselves at our command. And one of the implications is that you need to be in touch with the world in order to be in touch with yourself. So to be in command is not something that is takes place only on the level of the subject, but on the level of the subject in its relations to the in its relation to the world. To be at one's command is something that needs to be understood as against the idea of authenticity as being true to oneself, as if there would be something that I just have to find, that is already there, that is like pre-existing essence. The idea of that alienation affects our ability to be in a certain kind of command. Some wants to, I mean, points to the need to actively appropriate those relations to ourselves and to the social and material environment.
So Jaeggi relates her concept of alienation to the concept of autonomy. That's what she means when she says that when we are alienated, we do not have ourselves at our own command. But Jaeggi furthermore points out that alienation is a deficiency of appropriation. But what does this mean? Jaeggi says that any kind of appropriation always involves a relation to something else that is being appropriated. She claims that the way we relate to the world is fundamentally social. Alienation is therefore not just a problem for individuals. Jaeggi claims we can only understand what alienation means if we understand how it takes place within social relations.
To appropriate a relation, or the relation of appropriation, the way I see it means that there is, I mean, the first implication is that there's a need to relate to it. So this is not a pre-given understanding. It's also not a pre-given relation, but something that actively needs to be shaped. And appropriation also points to the fact that there's exactly not a unity, but relation between two different poles. There is such that there probably will remain an aspect of strangeness, or not of strangeness, but of otherness, of the other and the thing or relation that I appropriate, that will remain, while at the same time we somehow work through it, we identify with certain aspects of the other, we make it our own, but not in the. I do know that appropriation sometimes sounds so imperialistic. I mean, so, like this is a way to be in total control and to have somehow swallowed the otherness of the other. That's not what I mean when I work with the concept of appropriation. I do think that appropriation covers very well the idea that there is that what is appropriated is always, I mean, this is exactly what is at stake and remains. Not only is it a relation, but also a relation that is an ongoing relation that is transformed, that needs to be transformed in order to be, let's say, a vivid relation. Which, for example, means that the idea that, so one of the interpretations of alienations that I go against is the idea that alienation means homelessness. I mean, not homelessness in the means not being at home in the world in a certain way. And I would say we should be very careful about this idea of, I mean, what does it mean to be at home in the world? We have to be very careful not to understand this in terms of this is a pre-given place to be. This is something that I belong to in a certain traditional way. So my understanding of alienation is more, say, performative. We have to 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 appropriate. We have to undo alienation. We have to engage in those non-alienating relationships in order to create this kind of identification or being at home. But it's not something that just can be taken for granted, or that would then have to be defended against those who invade our space in the world.
So, if alienation always involves a certain distortion of social relations, we could ask the question, what kind of relations are autonomous? What would be the relations that Jaeggi considers good or healthy relations? Jaeggi points out that living a non-alienated life is not necessarily about comparing different cultures in terms of their normative quality, but rather about the qualitative abilities of these cultures to provide conditions under which social subjects can autonomously appropriate them.
So which relations do I have to appropriate in order not to be alienated? This depends. I mean, this depends on in which social context I already find myself into. So there are obviously relations that if I try to detach myself from them or abstract from the fact that I'm already in those relations in certain social structures. So if I do not actively relate to them, then I will still be shaped by them in a passive way. So the criterion for where do I have to be engaged, what do I have to appropriate, is actually this social context, the context of social practices that influence my own life. So if you think of, do I have to care about what's going on in some other places in the world? It somehow depends. In order not to be alienated, it depends on how you see the kind of influences that what goes on there has on your own life, and to negate those relations can have an impact on the way you understand, not only you understand your own life, but also the way you can act within your own life and social context. And if this is the case, then to the attempt to just get away with those relations seems to be normatively problematic. But that's a certain kind of being. I mean, it's something that in some way you owe to yourself to be aware of those relations that you are, whether you want it or not, are already into. That's
So at the start, Jaeggi claimed that she believes that to understand the rise of fascist and authoritarian movements, it is crucial to understand alienation. So how does a social relation within which social subjects are not autonomous cause them to be susceptible to authoritarian narratives? According to Jaeggi, this relates to the essential experience of a loss of control that alienated subjects undergo.
okay. So the connection between fascism and alienation, and why alienation might be a good concept to understand fascism, is their own slogan: "Get back control." That means that this is a control issue. It's an issue not only about material losses and gains, even if they play an important role, but they are connected to the impression that one has lost control. I mean, the loss of control and the fear of losing control, and at the same kind, somehow illusionary idea of what it would mean to be back in control. I do think that this has a lot to do with, I mean, the ideologies, illusions, the ideas of protection, of being at home only if you manage to close borders and so on. This has a lot to do with this anonymous idea. I mean, the idea of a loss of control has a lot to do with the fact that domination is such an anonymous force, is something that people sometimes cannot actually grasp. It's not so easy to understand where does the coercion that I'm suffering from, where does it come from? Who is in control here, actually? And then it's not only that, then you need scapegoats who you can blame for your own situation, but also the illusionary idea that there is something like a control that you can regain through those fascist communities, or a fascist idea of community, a fascist idea of being at home and being under control.